Chinedu arrived home much sooner than she had expected. The front door slammed shut, and moments later, he entered the office, his expression tense but controlled. He looked at Adaora, who was still sitting by his desk, the confidential documents spread out in front of her. For a few seconds, they just stared at each other in silence. Then, Chinedu spoke, his voice low and measured. "You've seen the files." Adaora nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "I did. And I need to know what's going on, Chinedu. How is Ebere involved in all of this? What are these offshore accounts? Why is her name all over these documents?" Chinedu sighed and rubbed his temples. "I was hoping to keep this from you, Adaora. But I see that's no longer possible." He walked over to the window, staring out into the night as he spoke. "Your sister, she was involved in my business before you and I ever met. She had a talent for finance and connections in certain circles that were useful. We worked together on several deals, mostly under-the-table transactions. She was very good at what she did, but she became too ambitious, too reckless." Adaora felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. This didn't sound like the Ebere she knew. Reckless? How? Chinedu turned to face her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. "She started making deals on her own, taking risks that I didn't approve of. She was trying to expand her influence, to build her own empire alongside mine. But she got involved with the wrong people, dangerous people. When I found out, it was too late. She had disappeared, and I've been trying to clean up the mess ever since." Adora's heart pounded in her chest. "What kind of mess? Where is she now? Is she safe?" Chinedu hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. I've been trying to find her, but she's gone completely off the grid. The people she was dealing with, they are not the kind of people you cross and walk away from." Adora's mind reeled. The sister she had always looked up to, who had always seemed so strong and capable, was now missing, entangled in a world of danger she never knew existed. And Chinedu, the man she had been forced to marry, was at the center of it all. She stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Why didn't you let me know what was happening with Ebere?" Chinedu's face softened, and he approached her slowly. "I didn't want to drag you into this, Adaora. I wanted to protect you. But now, it seems you're already in deeper than I intended." Adaora backed away slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" Chinedu sighed, his expression pained. "Ebere's disappearance has drawn a lot of attention, and not just from me. Obinna has been sniffing around, trying to find out what happened to her. He knows that if he can get leverage on me through her, he can take me down. And that puts you in danger, Adaora." A chill ran down Adora's spine as the pieces started to fall into place. Obinna's visit, his cryptic warnings, he had been trying to manipulate her, to use her as a pawn in his game against Chinedu. But now, she realized that the stakes were even higher than she had imagined. "What do we do now?" Adaora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chinedu's expression hardened. "We find Ebere, and we make sure Obinna and anyone else involved stays out of our way." The next few days were a blur of activity. Chinedu mobilized his resources, hiring private investigators, contacting old associates, and following every lead he could find on Ebere's whereabouts. Adaora was swept up in the frenzy, her days filled with meetings and phone calls, trying to piece together the puzzle of her sister's disappearance. Despite her fear and uncertainty, Adaora found herself growing closer to Chinedu. For the first time since their marriage, they were truly working together, united by a common goal. Chinedu's calm, strategic mind reassured her, and she began to see a different side of him, a man who was not just a ruthless businessman but also someone who deeply cared about those he considered family. But as the days passed with no sign of Ebere, Adora's anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that every moment they failed to find her sister brought them closer to disaster. One evening, after another long day of dead ends and false leads, Adaora sat in the library, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but sleep eluded her. The weight of everything, her marriage, her sister's disappearance, the dangerous world she had been thrust into, pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Chinedu entered the room quietly, his expression grim. He sat down beside her, and for a few moments, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. "I'm sorry, Adaora," Chinedu finally said, his voice low. "I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to be caught up in this mess." Adaora looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "It's not your fault, Chinedu. You didn't make Ebere disappear. We just have to keep looking. We'll find her." Chinedu nodded, but his eyes were filled with doubts. "I hope so," he murmured, his voice heavy with resignation. "But the more time passes, the more I fear that finding her might not be enough." Adaora frowned, leaning closer to him. "What do you mean?" Chinedu sighed deeply, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "Even if we find her, Ebere is involved with dangerous people. There's no guarantee that she'll be safe or that they won't come after us next. This isn't just about business anymore. This is about survival." Adaora shuddered at his words, the full weight of their situation settling over her like a dark cloud. "But we can't just give up, Chinedu. We can't leave her to face this alone." He turned to face her, his gaze intense. "I'm not giving up, Adaora. I promise you that. But I need you to understand the risks we're facing. These people, they don't play by the rules. They don't care about anything except power and money. If they find out we're looking for Ebere, they might see us as a threat, and they'll do whatever it takes to eliminate that threat." Adaora swallowed hard, fear tightening its grip on her heart. She had always known Chinedu was involved in a world far beyond her understanding, but hearing him speak so bluntly about the dangers they faced made it all the more real. She nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "I understand. But I'm not going to back down, Chinedu. We're in this together, and we'll face whatever comes our way, together." Chinedu looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for, Adaora. I'm glad you're by my side." He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Despite the fear and uncertainty swelling around them, Adaora felt a small spark of hope. They were in this together, and together, they would find a way to bring Ebere back. The next morning, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the private investigators Chinedu had hired finally tracked down a lead. A woman matching Ebere's description had been spotted in a remote town several hours outside of Lagos. She had been seen with a man who was known to have ties to a notorious crime syndicate, one of the very groups Chinedu had warned Adaora about. When Chinedu told Adaora the news, her heart leaped with both hope and dread. They finally had a lead, but it was leading them straight into the lion's den. Without hesitation, Chinedu made arrangements for them to travel to the town that afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Adaora couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The drive to the town was long and tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken fears. Chinedu's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he navigated the winding roads. Adaora stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of Ebere and what they might find when they reached their destination. When they finally arrived, the town was quiet, almost eerily so. It was a small, dusty place with narrow streets and run-down buildings, a far cry from the bustling city life Adaora was used to. They parked the car and followed the directions given by the investigator, leading them to a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. As they approached the house, Chinedu pulled out a small handgun from his jacket, checking the safety before tucking it back inside. Adora's breath caught at the sight of the weapon, a stark reminder of just how real the danger was. "Stay behind me," Chinedu whispered, his voice tense. Adaora nodded, her heart pounding as they approached the front door. Chinedu knocked, and for a few moments there was no response. Just as Adaora began to think no one was home, the door cracked open, revealing a gaunt man with piercing eyes. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. Chinedu's tone was calm but firm. "We are looking for someone, a woman named Ebere. We were told she might be here." The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but his expression remained guarded. "I don't know anyone by that name." Chinedu's jaw tightened. "We know she was seen with you. We are not here to cause trouble, we just want to find her." For a moment, the man seemed to consider this, his eyes darting between Chinedu and Adaora. Then, with a resigned sigh, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." Adaora followed Chinedu into the dimly lit house, her nerves on edge. The interior was sparse, with little more than a few pieces of old furniture and a layer of dust covering everything. The man led them to a small room at the back of the house, where a woman sat by a window, staring out into the distance. Adora's breath caught in her throat. It was Ebere. Ebere. Adaora rushed to her sister's side, her emotions overwhelming her. But as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. Ebere looked different, thinner, paler, her eyes dull and distant. Ebere, it's me, Adaora, she said softly, reaching out to touch her sister's hand. Ebere turned to look at her, but there was no recognition in her eyes. Adaora, she whispered, her voice weak. What are you doing here? Tears welled up in Adora's eyes as she knelt beside her sister. I came to find you, Ebere. We've been so worried. What's happened to you? Ebere shook her head slowly, her expression blank. I don't know. Everything's so confusing. Chinedu stepped forward, his gaze sharp as he addressed the man who had let them in. What's happened to her? Why is she like this? The man hesitated, then finally spoke. She got into deep with the wrong people. They used her, then discarded her when she was no longer useful. By the time I found her, she was like this, barely holding on. Adora's heart broke as she listened to the man's words. Her sister, who had once been so strong and capable, had been reduced to this, a shadow of her former self. We need to get her out of here, Chinedu said firmly. She's not safe. The man nodded. I can help you get out of town. Quietly. But you need to move fast, there are people looking for her, and they won't be far behind. Adaora looked at her sister, who seemed so fragile and lost. She took Ebere's hand and squeezed it gently. We're taking you home, Ebere. You're going to be okay. But as they prepared to leave, a sense of foreboding settled over Adaora. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The dangerous forces that had ensnared Ebere wouldn't let go so easily. And now, they were all in the crosshairs. The journey back to Lagos was fraught with tension. Chinedu and Adaora kept a close eye on their surroundings, watching for any signs of danger as they hurried through the narrow roads. Ebere sat quietly in the back seat, her gaze vacant, seemingly unaware of the peril that surrounded them. As they drove, Chinedu made several phone calls, arranging for extra security and safe accommodations for Ebere. Adaora couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread with every passing mile. They were moving deeper into dangerous territory, and it felt like the darkness was closing in on them. About an hour outside of Lagos, Chinedu's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. It's one of my contacts, he muttered to Adaora before answering. Adaora listened anxiously as Chinedu spoke in low tones, his conversation punctuated by terse nods and sharp responses. When he finally hung up, his face was grim. They know we have her, Chinedu said quietly, his voice laced with urgency. We are being followed. Adora's heart skipped a beat. She glanced in the rear-view mirror, and sure enough, a pair of headlights had appeared in the distance, growing closer with every second. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Chinedu's jaw clenched as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. We don't let them catch us. He pressed down on the accelerator, the car speeding up as they raced toward the safety of Lagos. But the pursuing vehicle matched their pace, drawing closer and closer with each passing minute. Adaora could feel the tension in the air, the fear gnawing at her insides. She reached back and took Ebere's hand, holding on tight as the car swerved through the darkened streets. We're almost there, Chinedu said, his voice steady despite the danger. Just a little longer, and we'll be safe. But as they neared the outskirts of Lagos, the pursuing car suddenly accelerated, swerving dangerously close to their vehicle. Chinedu swore under his breath as he tried to maneuver away, but the other car was relentless, forcing them off the main road and onto a narrow side street. Hold on, Chinedu shouted as he took a sharp turn, the tires screeching as they geared onto the narrow side street. The car skidded on the gravel, barely staying on the road as Chinedu fought to keep control. The pursuing vehicle followed closely, its headlights blinding in the rear-view mirror. Adora's heart pounded in her chest, fear gripping her as the reality of the danger they faced became painfully clear. She held Ebere's hand tightly, praying that they would make it out of this alive. The narrow street twisted and turned, the darkened buildings looming on either side. Chinedu's driving was expert, but the other car was relentless, refusing to let them escape. The sounds of screeching tires and revving engines filled the air, the tension growing with every second. Suddenly, the road opened up into a larger, more populated area. Chinedu spotted an opportunity and took it. He swerved sharply into a crowded market street, the chaos of vendors and pedestrians providing some cover. Adaora held her breath as they wove through the stalls and people, narrowly avoiding collisions as Chinedu navigated the chaotic scene. The pursuing car hesitated for a moment at the entrance to the market, then sped after them, flowing through the crowded streets. People screamed and scattered as the car barreled forward, determined to catch them. Chinedu, we can't outrun them like this. Adaora shouted, her voice filled with panic. There's too many people. Chinedu's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. We need to lose them in the city, he muttered. There's a safe house nearby. If we can just get there. But before he could finish, the pursuing car slammed into their rear bumper, sending their vehicle speeding sideways. Chinedu fought to regain control, but the force of the impact sent them careening into a narrow alleyway. The car came to a jarring stop, wedged between two buildings. Adora's head snapped forward as the airbag deployed, her vision blurring from the impact. Ebere let out a weak moan from the back seat, dazed but conscious. Chinedu groaned as he pushed the airbag aside, his face twisted in pain. Adaora, are you okay? He asked urgently, his voice strained. I'm okay, she managed to say, her head throbbing. She turned to Ebere, who looked pale and frightened but otherwise unharmed. Ebere, are you hurt? Ebere shook her head slowly, still in a daze. I'm fine, I think. But there was no time to assess further. The pursuing car had blocked the entrance to the alley, and they could hear footsteps approaching rapidly. Chinedu grabbed Adora's hand, pulling her out of the car. We have to move, now. They stumbled out of the vehicle, Chinedu supporting Ebere as they hurried down the alley. The narrow passageway twisted and turned, offering some cover, but they could hear their pursuers closing in behind them. Where's the safe house? Adaora asked breathlessly as they ran. Just a few blocks from here, Chinedu replied, his voice tight with urgency. We just need to get out of this alley and blend into the crowd. They emerged onto a busy street, the noise and bustle of Lagos surrounding them. Chinedu led them into the crowd, keeping a firm grip on Ebere's arm as they weaved through the throngs of people. Adaora kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart racing as she searched for any sign of their pursuers. But the crowd seemed to work in their favor. The men chasing them were forced to slow down, losing sight of them in the sea of bodies. Chinedu led them through a series of twists and turns, using the city's chaotic layout to their advantage. Finally, they reached a nondescript building on a quiet side street. Chinedu punched in a code on the keypad by the door, and it swung open with a quiet click. He ushered Adaora and Ebere inside, then locked the door behind them. The interior of the safe house was sparse but secure. Reinforced doors and windows, security cameras monitoring the outside, and a sense of safety that Adaora had almost forgotten existed. She collapsed onto a chair, her body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. Ebere sat down beside her, still pale and shaking. What happens now? She asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Chinedu crouched in front of them, his expression serious. We stay here for now. My men will be here soon, and they'll take you both somewhere safe. We'll figure out the next steps from there. Adaora nodded, too exhausted to argue. All she wanted was for this nightmare to end, for Ebere to be safe, and for them to somehow find a way out of this mess. But as she looked at Chinedu's grim expression, she knew that the danger was far from over. They had escaped for now, but the shadows of the world they were entangled in were still looming, and the fight for their survival had only just begun. The following days were a tense waiting game. Chinedu's men secured the safe house, and Adaora and Ebere were kept under close watch. Despite the protection, Adaora couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking just beyond the walls. Ebere slowly began to regain her strength, though the trauma of her ordeal still weighed heavily on her. Adaora stayed by her side, doing her best to comfort her sister while trying to piece together the fragments of the life they once knew. One evening, as they sat together in the small living room, Ebere finally opened up. Adaora, I never wanted this. I thought I could handle it, that I could control everything. But I was wrong. I made mistakes and now we're all paying for them. Adaora squeezed her sister's hand gently. We'll get through this, Ebere. We just need to stay strong, stay together. Ebere looked at her with tear-filled eyes. I'm so sorry, Adaora. For everything. For dragging you into this, for not telling you the truth. Adaora shook her head, her heart aching. It doesn't matter now, Ebere. We're here and we're going to get through this, no matter what it takes. But even as she spoke the words, a gnawing fear gripped her. The fight wasn't over, and she knew that the final confrontation was looming closer with each passing day. That one night, as the safe house was quiet and the city slept, Chinedu received a call. He listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. When he hung up, he turned to Adaora, his face set in grim determination. They've found us, he said quietly. Obinna's men. They are coming. Adaora felt her heart drop, the fear she had been trying to keep at bay crashing over her like a wave. What do we do? Chinedu's eyes blazed with resolve. We fight. We protect Ebere, and we end this once and for all. He moved quickly, arming himself and the men stationed around the safe house. Adaora could see the tension in his movements, the knowledge that this was the final stand weighing heavily on him. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air became suffocating. Adaora and Ebere huddled together in one of the back rooms, listening to the distant sounds of preparation as Chinedu's men fortified their positions. Then, in the dead of night, it began. The first gunshot rang out, echoing through the narrow streets. Then another, and another, until the night was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. Adaora clung to Ebere, her heart pounding in her chest as the sounds of the battle raged around them. For what felt like an eternity, the world outside was nothing but chaos and violence. Adaora could hear shouts, crashes, and the unmistakable sound of bodies hitting the ground. Every moment was a battle between hope and despair, praying that Chinedu and his men could hold their ground. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the gunfire began to subside. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the violence that had just taken place. Adaora held her breath, waiting, listening. Then, the door to their room cracked open, and Chinedu stepped inside. He was bruised and bloodied, but alive. His eyes met Adaora's, and for the first time in days, she saw a flicker of relief. It's over, he said quietly. We won. Adaora's breath left her in a rush, tears of relief welling in her eyes. She stood up and rushed to Chinedu, throwing her arms around him. He held her tightly, his body trembling with exhaustion and the weight of everything they had just been through. Ebere joined them, and for a moment, they stood together in silence, the nightmare they had been living in finally starting to lift. But even as the danger faded, Adaora knew that their lives had been forever changed. They had survived, but the scars of what they had endured would remain with them always. Yet, in that moment, as they held on to each other, she knew that they would find a way to move forward, together. And as the dawn began to break over the city, bringing with it the promise of a new day, Adaora allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finally find peace. What is going to happen to Adaora, Chinedu and Ebere? Will Adaora go back to his life? Will Chinedu take Ebere back? Find out in part 3. Thank you so much for watching, and please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoy this story, give it a thumbs up, comment and share. Thank you and God bless you.